I'm in Orkney today. There are 67 islands in the Orkneys. I'm in Lamb Home, and what I've come to see is something that looks like an ordinary Nissen hut, but in fact it's unique and famous throughout the world. That Nissen hut, it's really two huts placed end to end, and it's the only relic of a camp of huts that housed hundreds of Italian prisoners in the 1940s. They'd been captured in North Africa and transported here to labour on the gigantic task of building a concrete causeway to seal off the eastern approaches of Scapa Flow, where the Royal Naval Home Fleet was based. I'd been told I would find something miraculous inside, an atmosphere which can hardly be put into words. Look at the ornate work of this lamp. It was created from a corned beef can. Everything of beauty came from the simplest materials. Palombo, a prisoner who'd been an iron worker, spent 4 months of his spare time making the rude screen. The miracle is the unity of disguise which transforms the Nissen hut. It looks like fine brickwork. In fact, it's painted onto plasterboard fixed to a wooden frame. And even in the frieze below, the effect of stonework is complete. The dimension of it. The artistic genius was Domenico Ciochetti from Moena in the Dolomites. He came back in the 1960s to freshen it up. And he gave thanks in the name of his companions of Italian Camp 60 who had worked with him. 200 Orcadians attended a rededication service in the chapel at the end of his visit. It seems the effect of weathering has deepened the sensitive expression in the face of Jesus. This wayside shrine was a gift from the Dolomite community of Moena as a token of friendship with Orkney. Ciochetti also created this figure of St. George and the Dragon from barbed wire and cement. The story of the building of the chapel and its subsequent history has made it one of the most visited special places in Orkney. When the Royal Navy came into Scapa Flow in 1939, this square-mile quadrilateral of sea was thought to be invulnerable to submarine attack. But on October 13th, an enemy U-boat edged in from the east and sank the Royal Oak, and 800 men died. What the Churchill barriers did was link 4 islands with concrete so that such an attack could never happen again. It also linked the islands by road. So, what were known as the South Isles are now joined to the mainland of Orkney, and you can drive a car to a point just opposite John O'Groats. The German submarine that sneaked through and sank the Royal Oak had penetrated a defence of block ships placed between the islands in the 1914-18 war. The Churchill barriers lead to the village of St Margaret's Hope. Now Hope means a loch, and this is the loch. And in that loch in 1263, King Haucon's great fleet of dragon ships anchored to find reinforcements and sail for Scotland to fight battle with the Scottish king, and that battle took place at Largs, a very, very famous victory for the Scots. King Haakon sailed back to Orkney and died in the Bishop's Palace just before Christmas. His assembly of ships was the greatest ever seen until 1914, when the whole British war fleet anchored in Scapa Flow. This is the Watergate in the heart of Old Kirkwall. In an Icelandic saga, we are told how the greatest of the old Norse kings, Haakon, returned northwards to the Bishop's Palace, took to his bed, but after a few days he was able to visit the cathedral. At midnight of the 16th of December, 1263, he died. Across from St Magnus, a fine exhibition in Tankerness Museum reconstructed the Viking way of life and death from excavations on the island of Rousey, where a whole Viking settlement and burial ground had been uncovered. Skeletons and what lies with them tells you a lot. We know that these people were hunters and fishers, as well as cultivators of rye, barley and oats. The knives, bone pins, combs, pottery, farming tools, sickle and dads reveal the state of their technology. 2 boat graves were excavated. The wood had decayed, but the rivets showed the shape. In each case, the body of a man was laid surrounded by his swords, shields, arrows and axes. But who were the builders of this great stone circle, the Ring of Brodgar? 60 of them, the tallest 15 feet above the ground, forming a ring whose diameter is 120 yards across. No one knows. What we know is that it is a hot spot for uranium, which makes the Arcadians have a fear. This is the first time I've been here when the tide was exactly right for crossing to the island of Dursey on the northwest tip of the Orkney mainland, and it's just the right kind of day for it. What brings me is a collection of ruins that have intrigued expert archaeologists for a long, long time. Apart from the attraction of its setting, it's regarded as one of the most important sites in the country. Sorting out what is here is quite a job for an amateur. In one tight area, there's the foundations of Norse farms on the site of a Pictish settlement. And just beside it, there is the hall of a bishop's palace, and there's the ruin of a Norse cathedral. This is a chapel built by Earl Thorfinn, a pillager who caused this church to be built after he had been to Rome and received absolution from the Pope. He was known as Thorfinn the Terrible because he was such a tremendous fighter. He conquered much of Scotland, the Hebrides. He had 9 earls under him, and he came here to live a life of peace. The Picts were here in the 8th century. The Vikings came, harried them, set up farms, and then he came and made this his base. And it's become recognised as probably the finest archaeological site in Scotland and one of the most interesting to be found anywhere, because there's a history in stone from Pictish times through the Viking times at their peak. This monument on the wild northwest tip of the Orkney mainland commemorates a very sad event that happened in 1916. Lord Kitchener was in Scapa Flow setting sail for Russia. It was a very wild day, and 2 hours after they had sailed, they were asked to turn back. They turned back, and 40 minutes later, the cruiser Hampshire in which he was travelling struck a mine, and the ship went down and only a few were saved. The sea unites as well as divides, as is shown by the different layers of civilizations in these northern isles, vital strategically in time of war. In Orkney, more than anywhere else, you're aware of man's influence in the landscape, in monuments of stone and concrete. From western Norway to the mainland of Orkney is a distance of 266 miles, an easy journey for a Viking longboat. Finding the islands good for cultivation, the Vikings became settlers. Today, these wonderfully green islands are occupied by owner farmers, descendants of those who survived the bad farming times of the 1920s, 30s. The land here is so good that it can support 1 cow to an acre, and there is a creamery in Kirkwall to take the milk. Ian Scott, who farms redland, is one of the most progressive on high and low ground. He talked as we walked.
Well, it's just a mixed farm with beef cattle and sheep. The emphasis on beef cattle because that is certainly what suits the climate most in Orkney. However, here we have hills, and it is suitable for outrun for sheep and good for wintering the sheep on.
And this is a very old farm.
It is. Of course, it's not unique in that respect. But, I mean, we do know that it's been farmed continuous for over 1,000 years.
This one?
This one, yes, because it is actually mentioned in the sagas. Not as Redland, but as Renaland. And it is believed it is one and the same.
So do you think cattle have always been reared in this farm then?
Oh yes, oh certainly, because the evidence is clear here that there you can see where the thatch has come up underneath the eaves and whereas now there's a tin roof. So that would have certainly been a byre. And all the old buildings have similar pieces on them, and there is the evidence of cattle all over.
And what length of time are we talking about?
Well, let's say in this instance, this house itself is about 400 years old. It of course, obviously would have had chimneys, which I remember on the house, and it had a thatch roof with the flagstones underneath. So the insulation, in a way, was quite good. And also the original rafters are still there underneath that present roof. And this small window here is the original size of the windows, whereas the bigger ones had been put in later.
Is that a coat of arms I'm seeing?
Yes, it is, in fact. I found that when I was a boy. It had been built into the Milldam wall just as a building stone, and I found it by accident. And I took a rubbing of that, and the information I got back from the Lion office in Edinburgh was that it was indeed a family stone, and it dated from 1526.
That's very close to when Orkney became part of Scotland.
Very much so. And in that context, the first Scot that is reputed to have come to Orkney was Watty Scott, And he had consistently in the past, of course, living in the borders, he had raided into England, raided cattle and sheep and so on. But he got rather greedy and he started raiding into Scotland, and that was a crime. So he was arrested and tried in Edinburgh and found guilty and given the option, a rather nice option, of either execution or exile. And he very wisely chose exile. And so the Scots have been in Orkney ever since. They landed in Sandy, went to North Ronaldsay, and then came to the mainland here. And they've been in this vicinity since.
And is he an ancestor of yours?
Indeed.
Great. Now, I think I'd like to see some of the trees that you planted.
Yes, we can just walk up this way and we'll see them then.
Are you highly mechanised here?
Well, I wouldn't say highly mechanised, but we are. Like most farms in Orkney, we do have a fair amount of machinery. Coming round here, you'll see this stone byre here is not unique, of course, but it has the stone flags on the roof, as we call them, as slates. And you can imagine the weight of these.
Tremendous. Aye. That looks to be a very, very old one.
Well, it's 1848, it dates from. And interesting feature there is that there the rafters are held down, of course, by the weight of the roof. Whereas now, most buildings going up in Orkney have to have the rafters tied to the wall, just to cope with our weather conditions.
Great to see some trees in a treeless country.
Well, I like trees too. And I had the advantage of having the old trees here initially. And but they, I think, are maybe past their best. They're contemporary with the buildings we've just seen. And so I felt it was time that we planted more trees. And my whole family, of course, have been interested too. And they helped me to plant them and so on.
So how old are these?
Well, these are 6 years old, just planted from saplings. And you can see it's quite a variety.
Oh, it is.
Yes.
Hard and softwoods.
Yes, and a few colourful ones too, like the laburnums there. And I've planted maples as well. So there is a general variety. Well, here, Tom, we come to the burn, or redland. And this is, of course, where I've concentrated the planting of the trees.
Yes.
And on both sides of the burn. Of course, we have the moisture of the water too.
Great.
And the trees have obviously are doing no too bad.
You're doing very well. Tell me something about the Udal laws that govern the rights here.
Well, they of course have ancient origins, Tom, and they existed in Orkney since the Vikings first landed. But they were strengthened greatly by Jarl Ronald when he built his great cathedral to St Magnus. And as you know, that was begun in 1137. And so it's 850 years old, and they still exist in Orkney. And in fact, in the parish of Harry is possibly the strongest surviving area. And it is the oldest surviving land ownership in Britain. As such, we are very proud of our heritage in that respect. Well, here, Tom, we come to the oldest dwelling house on the farm. It is the old house of Langalure, and it in itself is, we feel, a part of not only our family heritage, but it's part of Orkney's heritage too.
In what way?
Well, it has interesting family associations. And also, it has quite a remarkable story connected with it. In the 1780s, one of my ancestors, Bessie Corrigal, was born in that very bed. And how it came about was that it was a new married couple, and they were expecting their first baby, and the mother was in labour in that nuke bed. And you can imagine a roaster of a fire on here, a big peat fire. And for the occasion, all the local women were called in. And at that time, they were called Howdy women. And on this occasion, it was 11 of them arrived, all from the township of Redland here. And it turned out to be a difficult birth. And of course it was fashionable. The father was put outside, out through the door there. But he was worried, as most expectant fathers would be. And he came back on frequent occasions to ask had the child arrived, and he was told it hadn't. And of course, because it was a difficult birth, they had no anaesthetic or any medical facilities then. So they gave the mother the only anaesthetic they knew, and that was ale. And in fact, they gave her in pretty liberal quantities. There was just one snag with that. The Howdy women themselves also took an equal amount. So I think their looking after the mother was a bit suspect. And however, the father came back, and eventually he was told that the child had just arrived. And he was met by a very long-faced woman, and she said the child was stillborn. And of course, he got a tremendous shock. And he said he wanted to see the little body. And they said, no, there's no way that you should, because you'll never have another child. But however, he pushed past this quite drunk, Howdy wife, and went through into the Ben end there and lifted this little naked body off the sea bank. And there, when he took it into his arms, she cried. And it was looked upon as a great miracle.
Would you call yourself a conservationist, Ian?
Well, I think so. In fact, I am certainly not the only one. I would contend that every farmer in Orkney is a conservationist. For instance, when we're ploughing or cultivating the land, cutting grass, if we happen to see a bird's nest, we would never dream of destroying that. We would always go round it. And I think generally living on the land is an important thing when we have such ancient past as we do in Orkney. The pastures going uphill, of course, is only a relative apparent expansion of farming in Orkney. Under the peat, in several parts in Orkney, there is evidence of ploughing. And this would be, say, about contemporary with Skara Brae, or just after. And the peat had come in later than that. So really the peat and the heather hills is relatively new. When you have lived here all your life, and when your ancestors have lived here too, you know, in fact, it is only a repossessing of the land that was farmed in the past.
Nowadays, an Orkney farm has to be at least 100 acres to provide a modern standard of living. There are currently more sheep in the fields because prices for cattle are down. But the Arcadians have always had to be adaptable. They're hard workers, and the quality of their farm stock is their best advertisement.